Somewhere inside a South Dakota mountain, sealed behind granite that hasn't moved in 10,000 years, there's 59 feet of black metal that nobody built, and nobody has ever explained. A stonecutter named Samuel Finch found it on a cold morning in March of 1923, 4 years before the first face was ever cut into that rock. And by his own family's account, he spent the rest of his life wishing he'd never gone looking. The wind that morning came down off the ridge carrying the smell of wet granite and old snow, and Finch felt it against his neck before he ever heard it coming, pulling his collar up without breaking stride. He was 36 that spring. He'd spent half his life reading the Black Hills the way some men read scripture, line by line, crack by crack, hunting for the parts that mattered. He was up on the ridge alone that day, chasing a vein of pegmatite, 3 miles past the last logging trail, figuring it might be worth staking a claim. What he found instead had nothing to do with quartz or feldspar. It was a crevice, narrow, almost invisible, tucked behind a granite overhang that had probably shed that same slab of rock for 10,000 years without a soul ever noticing, the seam hiding behind it. He noticed because of the cold. Cold air was pouring out of that crack like breath out of a dying man's mouth, and on a mountain where every hollow smells the same, pine sap and wet moss and iron-rich stone, this air didn't smell like any of it. It smelled like old copper pennies left too long in a boy's pocket, and underneath that, something Finch never did find the right word for, not in 40 more years of trying. He should have turned around right then. Instead, he dropped his pack, got down on his belly, and crawled in after it. The crevice ran back 11 feet before it dropped away. Then it kept dropping. 20 feet, 30, granite scraping his shoulders raw, his lantern throwing a shaking little circle of light that told him nothing except that he was still moving and still breathing. Somewhere around the 40-foot mark, he'd write later, the cold stopped being cold and started being something with weight to it, something that pressed. Then the passage opened up. He said the chamber ahead of him was big enough to swallow a barn whole, and he said that before he'd ever had a reason to think about barns, down in a cave. The air in there didn't move the way cave air is supposed to move. His lantern light didn't settle the way lantern light is supposed to settle. It slid clean off the far wall. The way light slides off a mirror it doesn't quite trust is there. That's when he saw it, lying along the chamber floor like something that had been asleep since before the mountain had a name, was a structure of dark metal, unbroken, seamless, stretching 59 feet from one end of that hollow space to the other. Wide enough, Finch couldn't lay both palms flat across it at once. Tall enough, at its highest point, to clear a man's head by a full foot. The metal wasn't the black of coal, and it wasn't the black of char. It was the black of a night sky with the stars scrubbed clean out of it. Finch touched it, and he said later his fingers went numb for 3 straight days after. The cold sinking so deep into the bone of his hand that his own wife didn't recognize his handshake come spring. He said the thing hummed, not loud, not a machine's hum, but a hum low enough he felt it in his back teeth. Before he ever heard it in his ears, one that seemed to breathe in time with something far beneath that mountain, something patient, something that had been down there waiting a long, long time before any drill bit or dynamite charge ever touched that ridge. Finch backed out of that crevice the same way he'd gone in, on his belly, alone, in the dark, and by the time daylight hit his face, the granite behind him looked exactly like it always had. No seam, no shadow, nothing to prove any of it had happened at all. except it had. And more than 100 years later, in the quiet corners of the Black Hills, where the old stories still get told around wood stoves and camp lanterns, some folks will tell you that mountain never let go of what it swallowed that day. They'll tell you the 4 faces carved into that granite years later were never only about pride, or art, or presidents. They'll tell you the carving was a lid. And whether or not you believe a word of it, the story of Samuel Finch and the thing he found under that ridge has never quite finished whispering through this valley. Before we go back down into that crevice with him, I want to ask you something. If a story like this one keeps you up a little later than you planned, if you're the kind of listener who likes their history with some dust and some dread mixed in, then you already belong somewhere. And it's right here. This is a quiet, late-night kind of channel. No jump scares, no shouting, just old stories told the way they used to be told. Slow and careful and a little too close to true. If that sounds like your kind of company, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications so the next legend finds you the moment it drops. There's a whole crowd of us trading our own local legends in the comments section long after midnight. And I'd like to hear yours. Now, let's go back into the dark. The story might have ended right there, with one stonecutter's private memory and nothing else, if it weren't for what happened over the next 13 months. That same year, state historian Doane Robinson had only just started floating an ambitious idea of his own, carving giant figures into the granite of the Black Hills to draw travellers out to South Dakota. He wouldn't settle on the exact mountain for another 2 years, and he wouldn't bring sculptor Gutzon Borglum out from the east until 1924. Whatever Samuel Finch found in that crevice, he found it more than a year before anybody had even picked out which ridge the carving would eventually call home. Make of that what you will. Local record, and I mean local, the kind kept in courthouse basements and church society ledgers, not state archives, holds that Samuel Finch wasn't a man given to tall tales. Neighbours called him close-mouthed and sober, the sort who measured twice and cut once, in his stonework and in his conversation both. That reputation is exactly why anyone believed him at all. 2 weeks after his descent, Finch talked a fellow stonecutter named Elias Cobb into going down with him. Cobb was 29, a widower, and by every surviving account a good deal less careful than Finch. He's said to have carried a rope, a second lantern, and a sketch pad, and to have come back out 40 minutes later with all 3 still in hand and almost nothing to say. He didn't look right coming out of that hole, is how his own grandchildren told it later, pale and shaking and quiet the whole walk back down. Cobb's family history holds that he never went near that ridge again for the rest of his life, and that he burned his sketches that same week. One page is said to have survived, tucked inside a family Bible, showing a rough outline some 50-some feet long, with a note scratched in the margin that just reads, "Not ours." The measurements passed down through what folks around here call the Finch account are oddly exact for a story with no surviving physical evidence. 59 feet in length, a little over 8 feet at its widest point, just under 6.5 feet at its tallest. Dimensions Finch is said to have paced off himself, heel to toe, 3 separate times, because he didn't trust his own eyes, the first 2. He described the surface as smooth, no rivets, no welds, no seam of any kind, a single unbroken shell, cold to the touch even in the dead of August, that turned back every file and chisel and hand drill he owned. A compass he carried that day spun loose and wild near the structure's edge and then went still and true again the second he backed off 6 paces, a detail his family has repeated so consistently over the decades that even the more skeptical local historians admit it's an odd thing to make up. He noted, in what his descendants call his field journal, that a pinch of granite dust taken up beside the structure showed a faint discoloration under lamplight, almost a greenish cast to it, and a smell that reminded him, oddly, of a struck match gone cold. A Rapid City physician and amateur geologist named Dr. Absalom Reed is said to have examined that sample, and his notes, filed with the Pennington County Historical Society and mostly ignored for the better part of a century, describe it as inert to standard acid testing and carrying a faint residual magnetism that didn't match any local ore. Reed, by most accounts a careful, unspectacular man, apparently never spoke publicly about that sample again after he filed the note. Finch's account also made it, in a limited and informal way, into the Keystone Town Clerk's log. The clerk at the time, a man named Milton Vance, is remembered locally for keeping meticulous, some said, obsessive records of even the smallest town business. Vance's ledger for that spring reportedly holds a brief, dry entry dated April 9th, 1923, noting that Finch appeared before the office to have his account of a cave discovery formally witnessed and dated. Nothing further survives in any confirmed public archive. The original ledger, town memory has it, was lost in a records office fire in 1938 that took a good number of other documents from that period along with it. A detail that hasn't done a thing to quiet the story over the years. There's one more strand to the story that rarely makes it into the retelling. Finch had a nephew, a young stonecutter named Wendell Finch, who by the late 1920s had gone to work for the crews clearing brush and prepping rock faces ahead of the carving itself. Family memory holds that Wendell turned down 2 separate work assignments on the northeastern face in 1926. Both times without giving foreman much of a reason beyond saying he didn't care for the sound the rock made under a hammer in that particular stretch. He kept his job. He just never worked that section again. Nobody wrote that detail into any payroll ledger or foreman's report that has ever surfaced, and there's no way now to check it against anything but family memory. But it's the kind of small, unglamorous detail that tends to survive in a family's oral history, precisely because nobody thought it was worth inventing. And then there were the tremors. Old-timers in Keystone have long talked about 2 short items said to have run in the Rapid City Journal that spring. A March 19th notice describing a faint underground tremor felt by several Keystone residents, cause undetermined, dishes rattling on shelves and at least one dog that wouldn't stop barking at the ground. And a shorter item on April 2nd mentioning a well along the Purdy Ranch Road that ran cloudy and grey for 3 straight days before it cleared up on its own. Neither clipping has ever turned up in surviving archive microfilm, and most serious local historians figure their later embellishments folded into the story sometime after the fact. But the tale holds on the same way it always has in these hills, passed mouth to mouth, more felt than proven. What keeps this story alive for serious hobbyists, though, isn't the tremors, it's the report. In 1925, 2 years after Finch's discovery, and 2 years before the first blast of dynamite ever touched that granite, an independent structural survey of the proposed carving site was reportedly commissioned to check the mountain's stability. Locals remember it as a 412-page architectural report, authored by a surveyor named Arthur Miller. And by every account that's surfaced, most of it reads exactly like what it claims to be. Dry and technical, full of load figures and granite density numbers. Except, so the story goes, for a single paragraph on page 287, a paragraph that references, in the flattest bureaucratic language you can imagine, an anomalous subterranean void of undetermined origin located within the northeastern face, recommended for structural containment prior to any surface excavation. No complete copy of the Miller report has ever surfaced publicly. What survives is secondhand. Descriptions from people who claim to have seen a copy decades back, references to it buried in other local papers, and a persistent old rumour that among certain Rapid City old-timers, the phrase structural containment was never really understood to mean anything structural at all. To understand why this story took root the way it did, you have to understand the ground it grew in. Long before Samuel Finch ever set foot on that ridge, long before any surveyor's stake went into that granite, the Lakota people had already given these hills a name and a weight far beyond stone. Paha Sapa, they called it. The Black Hills, the heart of everything that is. Sacred ground central to Lakota belief. Land, long understood to sit closer to the spirit world than most other ground on this continent. I'll say this plainly, because it matters more than anything else in this script. That isn't campfire talk, and it isn't legend the way the rest of this story is legend. It's real, it's documented, it's still deeply held today, and it stands apart from everything else I'm about to tell you. It's against that backdrop, ancient and sacred and already carrying centuries of meaning before a single face was ever carved into it, that the settler and mining communities of the early 20th century built their own smaller, stranger layer of story on top. Long before Finch's discovery, old miners in the Keystone camps already had a nickname for that particular ridge. An old-timer named Thaddeus Gray, who worked those hills from the 1880s until his death in the 1930s, is usually credited with the name that stuck, the Hollow Crown. Miners had been calling it that since at least the 1890s, decades before anybody thought to carve a president's face anywhere near it. Nobody agrees anymore where the name came from. Some blame an old joke about a rock formation shaped like a broken tiara. Others swear the ridge just sounded hollow when you struck it right, like a drum with something living inside. Whatever its origin, the name stuck, and when Samuel Finch's story started making the rounds in the spring of 1923, it didn't sound new to the old-timers. It sounded like a name finally catching up to a mountain that had been waiting on it. The valley itself seems built for a story like this one. Fog settles into these hollows most mornings, thick enough to swallow sound whole, and locals have long joked a man could shout his own name into that fog and never hear it come back. It's the kind of place where a story about something sleeping under the granite doesn't feel like an accusation. It just feels like weather. Keystone isn't even the only town in these hills with a story like it. Old-timers over in Hill City tell a similar tale about a ridge 2 valleys over. A story with different names and a different year attached to it, but the same cold air, the same seamless metal, the same instinct to seal it back up and walk away. Whether that's a second sighting or just the same legend travelling on its own 2 feet through 50 years of retelling is a question nobody around here has ever managed to settle. Here's where the legend gets its teeth, though. where it stops being a spooky story about one man's crawl into the dark and starts wrapping itself around the monument that actually stands there today. If you've ever visited Mount Rushmore, or seen pictures of it, you already know Abraham Lincoln's face isn't the end of the mountain. Behind it, cut into the granite, sits a chamber called the Hall of Records, a real, physical, unfinished vault. Gutzon Borglum started carving in 1938. Meant to hold the nation's founding documents deep inside the mountain itself. Construction on it stalled for decades. It sat open and empty for close to 60 years before a sealed titanium vault of historical records finally went in. In 1998, its entrance capped off with a slab of granite. The stated reason is simple enough: to preserve American history long after wind and rain wear the faces above it smooth. But around a campfire instead of a visitor centre, some ask a quieter question. Why that exact spot tucked behind Lincoln's head for a vault built to outlast civilizations? Why does a 20th century monument already contain a chamber built for permanence and sealing, on the same mountain where a 59-foot structure is said to have waited in the dark for who knows how long before Samuel Finch ever stumbled onto it? And if a mountain can hold one vault on purpose, built by hand, in daylight, on the record, what's stopping it from holding a second one, built for reasons nobody ever wrote down? Ask an old-timer in a Keystone diner what they really think is under all that granite, and more than a few will tell you, straight-faced, that the Hall of Records isn't the first vault ever cut into that mountain. It might just be the second. By the time real construction started on Mount Rushmore in October of 1927, the story of Samuel Finch's crevice had already started softening around the edges, the way most local legends do once official business moves in and starts making its own noise. The original plans for the monument called for a lot more than 4 faces. Gutzon Borglum's first design had the presidents carved down to the waist, full torsos rising out of the granite, alongside a grand stairway, and a history of the nation cut right into the rock. Money ran short again and again over the 14 years of construction. The Depression drained what little there was. Borglum died in March of 1941, and the country's entry into the war followed within months, and the whole project ground to a halt that never officially started back up. Only the 4 faces we know today ever got finished. That much sits in the plain record and nobody argues with it. But in Keystone, in the years right after the project quietly wound down, a different story made its way around certain dinner tables. Some old-timers didn't blame the Depression or the war or Borglum's death for the scaled-back design. They blamed the mountain itself, or rather, whatever the mountain had already been asked to hold on to. The word that went around, soft and rare, and mostly kept from outsiders, was that the deeper the carving went, the more certain men connected to the project quietly agreed that less digging, not more, was the wiser road. Fewer questions asked below the jawline. A monument finished at the face and nowhere further. A couple of the old blasting crews, according to town memory, had their own private rule about that stretch of rock long before anybody official ever said a word about it. Never set 2 charges in the same day on the northeastern face, and never work it after dark. Nobody could ever point to a written safety reason for either rule. It was just how it was done, the same way a man doesn't walk under a ladder, and eventually nobody working the site even remembered why. Whether that's a true reshaping of intent, or just a small town filling in the blanks of a project it never fully understood, Nobody can say for certain now. It's the kind of thing that only ever survives as a shrug and a knowing look over coffee. As for Samuel Finch, his own story faded even faster than the mountain's legend did. By most accounts, he never spoke publicly about that day again after 1924. Neighbours said he got quieter with each passing year, less inclined to work the high routes on the ridge, more inclined to stick to smaller jobs closer to town. Some who knew him later said loud underground blasting made him flinch, an odd trait for a stonecutter working in a region built on dynamite, and that he'd walk a mile out of his way sooner than pass too close to the base of that particular ridge. He married, raised 2 daughters, and cut monument stone for a living, the ordinary kind that marks graves instead of mountains, until his health started failing in the late 1940s. He died in 1957 at 69 years old in a small house outside Hill City, and he's buried in a modest cemetery not far from hills his family says he never once climbed again after 1924. The story might have died with him for good, if not for a slim, self-published 1961 pamphlet called Whispers of Iron Mountain, written by an amateur regional historian named Constance Ridley, who spent 2 years interviewing surviving members of the Finch and Cobb families before either the memories or the family members themselves were gone. Ridley's pamphlet sold maybe 300 copies, mostly at church fundraisers and the county fair, and it remains today the closest thing this story has to a written primary source. Copies are rare enough that serious Black Hills folklore collectors trade photocopies of it, the way baseball collectors trade rookie cards. Finch's own field journal, the one his family swears existed, filled with measurements and sketches and one phrase repeated in the margins that reportedly read, "The light doesn't sit right down there," was said to have outlived him by only a few decades. Family accounts differ on what happened to it. One granddaughter, interviewed by a regional folklore collector in the early 90s, claimed it was lost in a house fire in 1962. A separate branch of the family insists it just got misplaced during a move sometime in the 70s. Thrown out along with a box of other old papers nobody thought to look through closely. Either way, no verified original page has turned up publicly in more than 60 years now. What's left is memory. Family memory. Town memory. The kind that gets a little more polished and a little less precise with every retelling until what's left isn't quite history and isn't quite fiction either. It's something in between, the exact shape of every good local legend. Today, what's left of the story survives mostly in deep history forums, a handful of regional folklore podcasts, and the occasional Black Hills tour guide willing to tell it off the official script. Usually after the paying customers have gone quiet and the lights started to fail over the ridge. Real history, the kind written down in county records and national archives, is full of gaps. Gaps left by fires that took the wrong records at the wrong time. Gaps left by men like Samuel Finch, who saw something and spent the rest of his life choosing silence over spectacle. Gaps left by projects that changed shape halfway through, for reasons that might have been as simple as money, or might have been something else entirely. We like to believe everything important gets written down somewhere, filed and indexed and made permanent. But some of the oldest, strangest stories in this country were never meant for textbooks at all. They were meant for kitchen tables, for pickup trucks idling outside a diner, for grandparents lowering their voices right before they get to the good part. Nobody in Keystone will put the hollow crown and the Hall of Records together on paper. Not where you can hold it in your hand, but ask them over pie at the counter what's really sitting under all that granite, and watch how careful they get with their words. That carefulness tells you something on its own, even if it never tells you the whole thing. Maybe that's exactly where a story like this belongs, told at kitchen tables instead of carved into stone the way the rest of that mountain was. If this one moves something in you, pass it along to just one person. That's the only way stories like this ever survive. One person telling another before the light fails and the fog rolls back in. Until next time, keep looking at the shadows.